this slightly differently from most of the rest of the talks today. But my talk is very ambitiously titled Climate, Culture, and Change. And the climate, I think, is more readily presented by the other papers here. And as to culture, I think you can say that climate change is inherently a cultural issue, as it touches all aspects of human life. But I'm only going to here talk about a very sort of narrow definition of the word culture, and I'll talk about the arts. And my examples, because most of this is going to be a show and tell, my examples come from those arts that involve some kind of performing, or they take place over time, or that happen between people, whether that's in theaters or in everyday settings. And as to change, theater has been defined as the desire for change. And I think this applies more generally to other art forms. They express a desire to enter into an experience that may have transformative qualities to it, as fleeting as these moments might be, which is very different from saying that the arts can deliver a message or deliver some measurable behavioral change. And I think this can be an expectation when considering the urgency presented by climate change. But it's asking the arts to do both more than they can do, which is to fulfill an expectation which is better accommodated by other activities. And it's asking the arts to do less than they can do, which is to pass over the profound changes in perceptions that can sometimes happen. So climate change is not one coherent subject, which plays right into the capabilities of the arts to draw together many different kinds of experience. The truths that art tells can be very slanted, indirect, and even confused. And I think because of that, they're very vital in the struggle to understand uncertainty and complexity. The works of art that are emerging now in response to climate change are navigating many uncharted territories. The existing cultural forms and conventions of art may, but they may not, be the forms that can best express living with climate instability. So there's new languages, new ways of making art, and ways of recognizing even what counts as art that are developing. There's new relations forming between artists, scientists, politicians, the legal system, activists, and communities. So if you take the blockbuster movie, the YouTube video, the educational theater for young people, the satirical comedy, a West End show, the dialogues of the Occupy movement, the soap opera, urban street festivals, the rituals on the shorelines, songs in the allotments, dances in the middle of car parks, all of these are doing something different, and they're doing something for different audiences. Some artworks are good, some are not so good. And it's my work and others like me to reflect on what it is that they're doing. How do they work? What's the role of the artist? What are the aesthetics and the ethics of these experiences? How does a work of art create new forms of knowledge? How are the qualities of imagination engaged? So that we're in a particular moment where the critical frameworks for these projects are evolving along with the projects. So what I want to do now is not present one philosophical argument, but just talk through 4 examples of artworks and some of the issues raised specifically by climate change. So talking about live performance is a bit tricky because you really needed to be there. But I hope that I can present enough about each work so that it makes sense. To understand climate change involves grappling with many different forms of knowledge: the scientific, the measurements and models, the information and assessments and economic and political reports, the adversarial debates and media reports. And one of the problems for artists is how to, or even whether to, represent this information. For example, the artist Amy Balkin recites the Stern Report in public places. Other artists work directly with data sets and transpose them not into visual charts, but into sound works or into scores for performance. So Helen Mayer Harrison and Newton Harrison have been making artworks about what was then called global warming since 1974. This exhibition, Greenhouse Britain, Losing Ground, Gaining Wisdom, toured in 2008. The Harrison's exhibitions always feature maps. They work with a fascination for visualizing change over familiar ground, of placing oneself into another world. The animated map on the floor shows stages of sea level rise and storm surge projections up to 16 meters, so that the vibrant blue bits got bigger and bigger. And then they got smaller and smaller. On the walls are poems about climate change, interleaved with maps showing very radical plans for land use, for new kinds of human settlements, for reforestation and watershed management. And the Harrisons' idea was that they wanted to show what a graceful withdrawal from the rising waters would look like. So their exhibitions are just one stage in sometimes years of conversations with scientists, architects, planners, policymakers, and local communities, and with the public at their exhibitions. Now, these conversations are both the substance and the process of their art making, which is why I include this as a kind of performance. Conversation and negotiation become very integral to many artists' work. I think the Harrisons are particularly good at it. Their conversations are often described as opening the door for scientists and planners to think outside their institutional constraints, to visualize potential courses of action that emerge from an artist's point of view. This also means that the artwork is open to the same critical assessments as any other planning proposals. So the questions become not just, is this good art, but is the reasoning behind this sound? Which is in the art world, a very different kind of way of critiquing things. So the word theater means the place to see. That's where you go to see oneself and to see changes over time. So narrative, as in very naturalistic theater, like in television and film, in the soap opera, is a very conventional form. It's a very comfortable form and immensely powerful, drawing together audiences into very familiar worlds, but one with new meshes of situations, ideas, and human relations. There's an ease in watching a play in a familiar form. In a way, one has less work to do to understand and contextualize the ideas that are being communicated. So the first mainstream narrative theater piece on climate change in London was The Contingency Plan, a series of 2 plays by Steve Waters at the Bush Theatre in 2009. One central relation in that was between father and son, both of whom were glaciologists, and how each dealt with the frictions between science, scientific findings, and politics. The play The Heretic by Richard Bean at the Royal Court in 2011 similarly was a story about a scientist, but this one was I suppose more of a denier, although the science in the play was pretty awful. But the play was mostly about her family and her frictions with academia. So this is the theater of Chekhov. This is the frustrated love story, or the Whitehall farce, and the disaster movie. These are domestic dramas and political dramas, and one of their subjects happens to be climate change. Another work which employs a narrative structure, but in a less conventional form, is what's an audio tour called And While London Burns, made in 2006 by the arts and activist group Platform. It's monologues and music, and it's experienced as a guided walk through the city of London. One downloads a soundtrack onto an MP3 player, and with headphones on, starts in an underground Starbucks somewhere near the bank. A female guide's voice gives directions for the listener, and a man's voice tells his own story. He works in finance, and his life is falling apart. His girlfriend Lucy left her work in the city to become an activist. So he's walking to reconcile himself to that, and we are walking with him. So in a minute I'll ask Steve to play a short clip, but this is a section where we come to the Gherkin, the building that then housed Swiss Re, the reinsurance company. And on the ground floor is a restaurant, and sort of imagine getting taken through the city, and you're standing looking through a dark glass, seeing people having lunch. Nope, back. Yep. You're seeing people having lunch, and there's a bit of a woman's voice singing in this, and her words are kind of hard to hear, but her words are, "You already know enough." And it's about a 2-minute clip. So now, Steve, thanks. Nope. Back. It's the sound to me. That's it.
Cross the road here and walk to the base of the Swiss Re Tower. Walk leftwards in a clockwise around the tower. After Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, Chris Walker at Swiss Re said, "Katrina acted as a wake-up call. There's more knowledge available in this tower about the reality of climate change than virtually anywhere else in this country. There's a crushing paradox in Swiss Re's position. In order to ensure they have sufficient funds to meet the claims from the disaster, the company invests the capital the clients place with it, and this investment is strongly in the oil and gas industry, whose very profitability depends on an activity that is driving forward climate change. However, with the arrival of carbon trading, the sky is up for sale, After all, climate change is another business opportunity.
Stop walking. Stop where you are. The transparent me, the thin sliver of me on that glass, right there. Look at the reflection. Is it me? Or is it you? This tower is where Lucy worked. This is where she worked it out. I came to a natural catastrophes modelling seminar here, high on the 35th floor. When she walked into the room, I just couldn't concentrate on anything else. I just couldn't keep my eyes off her. A week later, we had our first date here. In this restaurant, we were sitting at the table in the corner, over there at the back. We spent hours talking, we just talked and talked. And the world seemed to disappear from around us. I didn't even hear the last orders well. And she spoke what I'd been thinking. She put words to my worries.
But I think the guide's narrative, the woman's voice, unravels what a platform called the carbon web. So that's the tight interrelations between the corporate financial world, oil extraction, and climate change. And the male protagonist narrative, the journey of discovery of himself in relation to financial operations and climate change. So that as a listener, you walk with them both. And the city itself has changed. Familiar streets are made very unfamiliar. And the act of walking is itself like a narrative. One walks one step at a time into the flow of capital and oil. In performance of whatever genre, the human body is central, and the relations between performers' bodies and those of the audience or participants are very strong. They're vibrant connections through which communication is made, whether there's also the sound of the human voice. So this is an empathetic connection made through watching the expressiveness of the human body. The meaning expressed and forms of connection are influenced by social norms and cultural traditions, but it's also a very immediate, visceral connection. It's called a kinesthetic empathy, and it's the subject of much research on what it is and how it happens. But it's a very ready example. When one watches dance, there can be very subtle changes in one's own body as a kind of moving with the dancer. And this is a highly emotional realm. Connection is made through the movement of the body to some very complex emotional conditions. And the brief example I want to show is Endangered Species by the choreographer Siobhan Davies. The piece was part of the Cape Farewell exhibition on climate change works at the Natural History Museum in 2007. Video of the dance is shown through an exhibition case in a way that makes it appear as if the dancer is inside, a very small, delicate figure. She wears a costume with long bending rods that increase in number as the dance progresses. These allow her to explore her territory, to extend her body's capabilities, to gauge her position. Her costume is a technology, but it's one that eventually limits the dancer, separates her from the world in which she's already enclosed. I don't have the videos, but there's some stills. The piece obviously has very symbolic associations about technology, extinction, about the human as an animal exhibited in a museum. But I want to consider the captivation of watching the human body move. The relation between the viewer and the dancer in this piece it's on video, so it doesn't have the physical immediacy of dance, but that sense of empathy still operates. The intensity of this connection and the contexts in which it's made can, in some instances, convey and communicate emotions that aren't really fully articulated. They may not have names attached to them, names like fear or sorrow or happiness. I think there can be a rush to articulation, particularly with performances about climate change, to the argument, the issues, the information. And similarly, there can be a rush with very simple and predictable emotional ranges. So my point here is there's much more experimentation to be done in developing the nuances of emotions, in the ways that bodies communicate, in art and more widely, and how the arts can convey what may be new and very unmapped forms of feeling. So one of the challenges of climate change is the ability to conceive of the future of extreme uncertainty and vulnerability. And this usually gives rise to very dystopic narratives. So I want to close, this is the last work, with a work which is very much in the present, but that very gently leads towards a different kind of future. It doesn't have an overt relation to climate change, but it does engage with the environment, with human consumption, social patterns, and culture in its widest sense. So Feast on the Bridge is a yearly summer event since 2007 as part of the London Mayor's Festival. Southwark Bridge over the Thames is closed, and overnight a table is set. The next day there's entertainments, music, sideshows, and a massive public feast that goes on long into the night. The artist Claire Patey brings it together with dozens of community groups, hundreds of artists, craftspeople, schools, musicians, and of course the public. Now I include Feast on the Bridge here because it can be seen as a work of social practice art. So just as a sculptor works with tangible materials and shapes, social sculpture or social practice art works with and in social and environmental situations, with communities and environments, sculpting, as it were, in the social realm. It's what's called a slow form of activism. Like many similar projects, Feast on the Bridge offers the chance to practice how social life can be different. Supporting many of these works is the view that society has to be otherwise than it is now. And this could mean that human communal life could be richer, could be more convivial, life could actually be better. This is a mayonnaise ritual that happened at high tide and low tide. People got together and they made mayonnaise, and the hens were on the bridge as well. So I'm not suggesting that making mayonnaise is the solution to climate change, but it might be. We don't know. Now, not all works are quite this utopian, but I think there's a quality to many similar works that exemplifies an ethical capacity that goes back to Aristotle, and I think is strikingly relevant now, and that's the idea of phronesis. For Aristotle, phronesis is an ethical knowledge in a practical situation, a kind of practical reasoning or practical wisdom. It's knowing what a situation calls for in the way of right action, even when the situation is so complex and unprecedented that one doesn't even know what right action would be. It's when one's principles or beliefs or habits of conduct fall short. You don't even know how they should go if they were going to go right. Aristotle and others relate it to a form of rhetoric, to the back and forth conversation, and how one figures things out not by working from first principles and argumentation, but by listening to what the other person has to say and coming to an agreement about what to do. Phronesis comes about with experience, shows itself in timeliness, in the gift for nuance, and the ability to improvise in situations of uncertainty. So these talents for improvisation course through all the arts, not just the performing arts. The arts educate, they can be moving, they can bind cultures together, or they can radically challenge the assumptions of culture. They can entertain. But it may be that this practicing of improvisation, the capacity to improvise, the capacity to respond to change that comes from the arts is what's most affecting or most inspiring in a time of climate instability. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Wallace.
You're welcome.
Very, very interesting. I think it's fascinating that there is this link between art, and climate. It affects everything, really, doesn't it? Yeah. Do we have any questions, please, for Wallace? Apart from Robin.
Oh, that's fine.
Yes, Judith.
Thank you. A comment really. Thank you very much for that. I suspect most of it, a lot of it was quite over my head, but I think I got some of it. And I'm just noticing the word tipping point you got on your final slide. design, because that was a word that was bandied around a lot a few years back, the tipping point in climate change. And it's kind of, you don't hear about it quite so much, but it does seem to me, listening to all the talks today, which have been wonderful actually, that there's either the perfect storm that the chief development scientist talks about, which is all bad, you know, it's food insecurity, it's water shortage, it's conflict, it's global warming, it's disaster. But on the other side, maybe almost like the flip side of the coin, there's all the sort of optimistic opportunities to change the way we really think about how we live our lives and how we interact with each other, and the sort of things that we've heard about from the WI, which are very inspiring and no doubt brings in the kind of things we were talking about. But somehow that seems to me the, you know, the positive tipping point. Maybe there's enough happening at some either grassroots level or enough ripples on the pond or enough people from different areas getting somehow involved in something that's going to change that perfect storm into something a bit more promising.
Yes, I think that last scene was taken earlier this year in March, and the sun was shining.
Yeah, just to comment, the organizations I listed are organizations that are working particularly with the arts and climate change. And taking the point, I think it's been 5 years or 6 years making, probably would not have that name now, but it was a part of that way of trying to encourage the arts to do more. Because it has actually been quite a struggle over the years to get the artists to take climate change as a subject. It hasn't at all been. You would think it would be very obvious and very easy, but I think there's a lot of hesitation about being identified with the environment or with any particular issue. Most artists, a lot of artists will resist that. And I think there is a barrier. It's all the science, it's everything we've been listening to today, and the artists aren't going to be in the room. It's a whole different kind of knowledge, and the knowledge that artists can bring to this is beginning. You know, organizations like the National Director UK for a lot and so on, but many artists working on their own. It's not just organizations, but it's quite a difficult thing to get the artists interested. Yeah.
Which
certainly through the 70s and the 80s, artists were moving out of the gallery and out of the theatre and experimenting with lots of new forms, which may have nothing whatever to do with the environment and climate change. But those new forms meant that art was very different. It was happening in social situations. It didn't look like art. And I think a lot of those ways of working now, it's very easy for artists then to bring in ideas about the environment and climate change, but that's the way they already work. They can talk. Conversation is a big part of a lot of these works, and I think it's that